My name is Matthew Durington. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice, and I direct international studies. I'm going to talk very briefly, not really talk, just give a few points on how we developed this particular panel, which was a late but welcome addition to the program today. And then Rodney is going to also talk, it's going to reflect conversations that we've been having about this topic. But then what we really want to do is that thing that's said very often but isn't always fulfilled. We really want to hear from everybody else because it's really of the moment, and I know a lot of folks are thinking about some of these topics that we want to try to bring into the conversation today. What I often try to talk about is the difference between real time and academic time. If real time's moving like this, academic time is moving like this. Maybe bureaucratic time is somewhere beyond that too. But this comes out of conversations that have been somewhat philosophical, somewhat pragmatic, but also meant to engage a critical consciousness. And if we're reflecting that not only with what we're doing as a faculty, but imparting that to our students to develop a critical consciousness, but also thinking about what is the core, and is the core reflective of the moment, and if it should be and can be. This came out of an op-ed, or my inclusion in this panel came out of an op-ed that I wrote. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates and got inspired and fired off an op-ed. And then after talking to a couple of colleagues, said maybe don't premiere this out in the public yet, but start sharing it with some folks like Rodney, Tim, and some others to maybe get a conversation going, because it reflected a conversation I've been having with students about whether their views in their world was being reflected in the core curriculum or even in the curriculum at Towson University at all. And so they're conversations that we've been having for a while between faculty and students on the core. I advise over 100 students, listening to those students talking about their struggles to find a metropolitan core course. My own thinking about, for those of us who have been here for a decade or so, if the person's in here that can define the Metropolitan University, please stand up. Right, so you know, what is that core left over from? What's it doing at this moment? The student sit-in and the list of requests that occurred at the end of the fall semester have, in my opinion, given us another gear in that real-time academic time divide to drive in toward inclusiveness in the core. And the question is, how do we, or do we even meet them where they are? And I would hope that our ethos is to meet them where they are. This isn't about current buzzwords. You know, anytime the term microaggressions come up, I always like to have that conversation, but I always say, let's also talk about macroaggressions that have always been occurring too. Those things that have always been around that we could argue are part of the fundamental American question that we've been grappling with for quite a long time. Are we to highlight some of those questions too, if we were, say, going to focus on race? Is that at the expense of other identity notions or others that we could also be talking about? So in that sense, is the core reflective of the institution? Is it reflective of the moment? Is it reflective of a liberal education? Some of this comes from my own background as a graduate student in the 20th century at Temple University in the mid-90s, when that university was faced with a challenge about race, and at that point, discussions of multiculturalism and what have you. The president and the faculty at Temple decided to implement a race core category and charged every single faculty member and department at Temple with creating a course. And those courses weren't homogenous, they were critical. Some of them were on one side of an argument, some of them were on the other, but it was something that was broadcast throughout the entire university, percolated to the students, fostered a critical dialogue and the development of a critical consciousness. And as a graduate student in anthropology at that point, a lot of the graduate students were charged with teaching those courses on, in my department, the anthropology of race and racism, and having reached a critical consciousness about race and thinking about race from my undergraduate experience and earlier on, really gave me the opportunity to start thinking about how we convey this to students. Are we meeting students where they are with their ideas about race in the critical moment? So if we're going to do something about this, where are we philosophically? Where can we do pragmatically? Are we going to charge the faculty with doing something on this? Are we going to charge our administration with helping us do something to meet students where they are, to possibly develop a core category on race and racism? Or is that going to be included in something else? Should it replace the metropolitan category? Should it be included in diversity and difference? Rodney's going to give you some statistics to kind of let you know where we are with that discussion at the moment. And what I would argue is that, lest anyone who thinks that all we're doing is kind of giving lip service to a moment, there are a lot of engaged faculty and staff and students on this campus that the student sit-in wasn't a surprise. It was a part of a momentum building that had been occurring for a while. And my argument would be that if we develop something along these lines, something that would foster a critical consciousness, that would talk about that fundamental American question, we really are preparing our students for the real world, for the diverse world that they're entering, and to give them that skill set to do so. So that's where I'm coming from with this. And again, I don't want to dominate the conversation. I think anyone who's been thinking about this has their own opinions. But when Rodney and I started this conversation, after I shared my thoughts with him and some others, we really thought, what an opportunity to not just foster a dialogue amongst the faculty that attend the January conference, to meet students halfway, at least. You know, can we give some lip service to do so after all the bravery that was exemplified by them in the sit-in and other opportunities that they've been able to do so on the campus over the last few semesters. And then Rodney and I thought, okay, let's think about where we are philosophically with this, but where are we pragmatically? What can we actually do in terms of the state? What Rodney was just showing us with the COMAR and the different types of categories that are there. What can we do to meet students halfway? What can we do to meet them where they are? What can we do to drive a critical consciousness? Can this be a singular accomplishment of Towson University to show the rest of the system, to make us something special in this regard? So that's where I am with this. And I'm going to turn it over to Rodney so he can talk a little bit about the pragmatics too.
During Dr. Chris' presentation, she certainly included a quote in terms of how implementation is critical. And one of the things I remember from my days back in commercial banking was a quote from Lynn Shostak, who perhaps inelegantly said, "The concept is easy, implementation's a bitch." And that was a quote from back in the 70s, and that just has stuck with me ever since. And I think particularly in trying to address this, I don't want to have the pragmatic issues overwhelm us, but by the same token, if we want to go forward with this, we need to give a lot of thought in terms of how the implementation might take place. And so when the sit-in had occurred and Dr. Chandler ended up signing the agreement, one of the things I thought was, what's the big deal? We have a diversity category, and I was assuming that we're covering this. We have a lot of coverage in terms of issues related to African American culture, race relations. And so what I did was to then go to the list of core curriculum classes. And so here are my findings. Okay, we have 31 courses within Core 13, our diversity category. And what I did was a content analysis just based on the titles themselves. And what I found was, of those 31, only 6 of them addressed either using terms African American or Black or race. And of those that specified race, it was just not race alone, but race coupled with other areas such as gender and things like that. I subsequently went through the entire list of our core curriculum classes. did a keyword search and discovered no difference. That everything that we have at present is just merely embedded within the diversity category. And so when Matt and I first started talking about this, I have to admit I had very mixed feelings. In part of my own academic career is I spent 9 years teaching at a historically black institution. And one of the things that was very memorable to me was because I worked with a lot of minority-owned businesses in some of the consulting that I've done. And I remember a gentleman that had an engineering company. He was an African-American. He was an alum of Annapolis, the Naval Academy. He had been a captain and had captained attack submarines during his naval career. And he was relating a situation he had. And this is a guy that was in a suit that I've never had the money to be able to buy. But he was telling this experience that he had with out in the Midwest, where he was talking about the capabilities of his company, and he happened to mention that he had incorporated under certain parts of the federal government, under 8A. And he said immediately he could see a change in the person that he was talking to, that the face sort of blanked out, and he was immediately perceived as being less qualified, simply because of his birth and his heritage in terms of his ancestry. And so, looking at a topic like race, part of my benevolence also is on a personal level. I have a child who has struggled throughout his life because of being on the autism spectrum. I have other relatives who are gay and transgender. And so, thinking about race, and not to dismiss the importance of it, but to try to put it into perspective, is focusing on race any more or less important than whether we're talking about gender, sexual identity, and things like this. So from a philosophical perspective, I really look forward to the discussion that we have today to help me kind of wrestle with this. But the other side, and from a pragmatic standpoint, is again, if we go forward with this, to one extent, as you probably inferred from my presentation, this is a zero-sum game, because we're already at the high end in terms of the credits that we can embed in our core curriculum. And so if we were to make this a separate category, that would mean that it would displace something else, which makes then the tough decision in terms of, okay, what goes? But also is thinking forward with this is, if the intent is to expose all students, then where should this course exist? Or this, not course, but category, if we go forward. Keeping in mind that we bring in about 2,700 freshman students each year, but we bring in about 3,200 transfer students. And traditionally, most of the gen ed courses have been during the freshman and sophomore year, and the transfer students, for the most part, may only take 2 core courses with us. So if we go forward with this, is this intended to be an upper level course? And so what are the implications of that? So from my perspective, I don't have answers to this, but I'm great at posing questions. And so with that, I'd like to then turn it over to you to start the dialogue in terms of where we might go with this.
Just to get perhaps the conversation going, with what Rodney has posed to us, I think the questions that we have in front of us are a few. Could we create a race and racism core? What could we call that? Would it be a critical studies of race? Could it be something that, even if we wanted to do that, how would we go about doing so? Another strategy is to perhaps further integrate race as a topic into existing core categories, such as the diversity core. As you can see from the numbers that Rodney put up, I find those appalling, quite frankly, especially for where we are in the United States and where we are regionally, and in terms of our location in this specific state. I think personally we should be doing much more, and I think sometimes we're so siloed in our respective departments, curriculum, colleges, what have you, that we may think that what we're doing is being replicated somewhere else, but it might not be. Another strategy would be to what I've advocated, which is reflective of what students have expressed to me as their frustration, is to eliminate the metropolitan core category and replace it with this one. Whether folks have a vested interest in the metropolitan category, they may. I'd like to hear those type of arguments. For me, with the students that I advise, it's been the most frustrating core category over the last 5 years for students to not only attempt to complete, but to find a course that they actually want to take, and that would work towards their own personal educational goals. Another strategy would to create a new charge for our provost, now interim president, but will be provost again, and our associate provost, who's the current provost. But they've already started with this. My colleagues Zosha Stuckey and Alicia Aseltine worked with Dr. Chandler to create a diversity initiative, which I thought was a great step towards trying to work on these issues already. I think there's been momentum building for this. It may just not have been on the surface. And as I was saying, I think the students allowed us to get into that different gear to bring real time and academic time together. Or we can do what the students have accused us of doing as a faculty and institution, and perhaps even as a society, and do nothing. And I think if we do nothing, then we're failing them. So my hope is that maybe following some of those strategies, or offering your own ideas, or perhaps things that you've tried to do as practices or curriculum or whatever, maybe we can get a number of different strategies or some ideas generated today that then we could use to inform our provost's office about what we're thinking about trying to do as a faculty in relation to the core. Now, I can keep notes up here. I could also ask for a volunteer to perhaps use the, we have a note taker? Okay, because I can tell you right now, the only consistent thing in my evaluations by my students is, this is the best class I've ever taken in my life. Thank you for the laugh. It's okay. That was an attempt at a joke. The other one is, for the love of God, please stop writing on the whiteboard, because my handwriting's terrible. So I'm glad that there's a note taker in here, because my handwriting quickly turns into abstract art after about 6 words. Okay, so the note taker's here, but we could all perhaps keep notes on this, and I'm going to turn it over to the floor, and hopefully we'll not hear crickets.
Sarah Gilchrist in the library. I'm also part of the Towson University Social Justice Collective, which Alicia and Zosha are part of, and a couple of other people in this room. And we met with the students on the 5th, and we asked them what they would like to see us do. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was asking professors that have an interest in race, and not just race by itself. I think that part of the problem is that we think of this as checking a box. And it's not just checking a box. It's looking at race and sort of the intersectionality of race and gender and culture. We need to find professors that talk about that. Maybe it's not in the title of their course. And we need to ask them to perhaps consider teaching a TSUM. A class that would definitely get the freshmen that come to the university interested in discussing this and sort of plant a seed for discussion on the larger campus. But I think that you're right, that we also need to continue that throughout the curriculum. One of the things that we as librarians really like about TSUN is that we get to talk about critical analysis and information literacy, and that is lacking in the transfer student population because we don't have that contact with them. We would like to see maybe a midpoint where we can also do critical analysis as part of looking at race. librarians, we're looking at information literacy and analyzing things. We would like to see a midpoint for that. And then just now we were talking about maybe a capstone, some endpoint where we ask students to display these critical thinking skills. And I think that could be a way that we talk about not only race, and race is definitely important. We shouldn't just say, you know, it's not just all lives matter. The Black Lives Matter movement is important, and our students are important because they're focusing on an issue that hasn't been talked about. So Towson Seminar would be a good place to start with that. You said that we don't have enough sections of it. I know that's true. If we could find professors that are interested in participating and building on that, I know that I would be happy to help support that as a librarian, and then there are several other librarians that can support that information literacy component of that. So that's where the students are right now.
I think we have a comment over here.
Okay, so obviously I'm Delta, so I'm involved with diversity. I teach the courses in Deaf Studies, various courses actually, audiology, speech language, phonology, and Deaf Studies. And my name is Jody Gray. This is interesting because we're talking about whether we should create a unique core category, and I don't know the answer to that because I don't know that that's what the students want. I think that the students want our classes to include diversity within each course. So for example, I teach a deaf culture course, and on the evaluation, the African American students often said that we don't include African Americans or Black issues into the deaf culture class. So we have a category for that, but it hasn't been embedded into the class. So I think that's the concern with the issue itself. So I think that it would be fine to have a specific core category that talks about race issues, but I think that we need to embed it within each coursework so that we have diversity included in every class.
Here, here.
Again, I appreciate both those comments because it always reflect my feelings too. And my problem with all this discussion is that race doesn't exist. I mean, race is a social concept. And creating a category, like somehow if we have a category of just race, then we check the box, we're okay. And I think that's absurd. Racism, unfortunately, very much exists. It's this cancer that poisons critical thinking. And I think the discussion has been that how do we address, I mean, how do we, 21st century society, the world, that has been plagued by racism for such a long time, how do we deal with this in critical thinking skills? How do we incorporate this in the curriculum, across the curriculum, and so that our students are better informed of the world in which they live, all of our students, and can deal with these issues? I think it's a social problem, but I don't think it's something that we just say, oh yeah, we deal with this. I mean, of course we care about this. We are an education institution that is committed to sort of advancing humanity. So of course we care about this. Like, well, yeah, then how do we demonstrate that? How do we incorporate this in our curriculum? It's more than just words. I mean, words matter. But I'm very concerned that we just the approach that bureaucratic institution might take. Oh, we have to create a category, so therefore we're done. And that won't do anything. And that it has to be focused much more than that. So I don't know the answer to this question. Again, we had some discussion in the other day. We need free and open discussion. We need to challenge people. We challenge beliefs. And I don't know how to actually carry that out, other than I'm all for that. I mean, but so I really sort of found like, how do we go forward with this? I don't want to sort of like find. There's no simple solution. This is something that we've dealt with for centuries, millennia. And but I appreciate the discussion. I appreciate the comments that other people have made. And I think this is the right thing. It's like it's this incorporation. It has to be an integral part of who we are, what we are. And students and faculty and legislators and community have to understand that. And how do we communicate that? This is what this room is full. And so I mean, this is obviously something people care about, and something we want to make progress in. Where do we go? I mean, I don't want to just have a simple, like, oh yeah, we just check it off. That's not great for your.
Karen Donaker, the Department of Family Studies. I'm kind of covered for all along, and I think for me, I remember
going back to a race category that takes us kind of back to that same discussion in the 90s. But for me and for the courses that I teach, you know, at the upper level, it is the intersectionality. Right? It's not just race, not just gender, but there, you know, you made the reference in the very beginning, microaggression, macroaggression. The microaggression is where the students are focusing right now, but if the intersectionality has to go beyond race, culture, and gender, because if we don't acknowledge the macro level systems that involve socioeconomic status and poverty, and where that connects to race and gender and culture, and the systems that are kind of doing it, then it's going to be very much these silos again, talking about race here, talking about gender here, and talking about, you know, in these different categories. But the intersectionality to me would be the basis. And you mentioned this metropolitan perspectives. Our department teaches with 14 sections of a metropolitan course a semester, and it's a family resource management. But there's a lot of overlap in terms of those concepts of intersectionality there. But the metropolitan perspective offers a perspective of looking at resources, poverty, city structures, policies, and how those macro level structures are influencing how people are interacting in an urban culture. And so there's room to expand the core as well that would include more of an intersectionality piece. But I would, you know, I don't like all these separate categories because it's, you know, I'll give you an example. In one of my courses, we did Baltimore City riots from a theories perspective. Let's analyze this. The students all analyze all these incidents across the country that were African American males. We move on to feminist theory, and I bring up the fact that there are just as many African American women who experiences that never hit the news, and they're flabbergasted. So we can't just talk about them separately. But I don't know that just taking another little pocket here, we'll call it race and check off the box. But the metropolitan perspective has something valuable in it, and maybe other departments haven't seen the value of it if they're not looking from this kind of more macro level. So
I appreciate all the discussions of intersectionality. One of the things that we're doing in our concentration this spring is we're using some of the same material in all the courses as we lead up to the 1-year anniversary of the uprising events, whatever you want to call them, in April in Baltimore. And as a thematic, and we're calling it the right to the city. And it's dealing, you know, following Virginia Dominguez and others, about how race intersects and compounds and moves along those contours of all these other different, well, as you can see on the spreadsheet or what have you. Maybe, you know, something as, you know, to try to get some attention to the issue, to advocate for the elimination of a category, maybe too much. Maybe it's, as you're saying, expanding a category. From my perspective, I think where we get tripped up on is metropolitan, because of the tradition of what that term has meant at the institution. And what I was arguing when we were trying to define metropolitan before, that why could metropolitan also mean cosmopolitan? Why couldn't it mean all these other different things that we could expand it out? But we never really got that, as far as I'm concerned, a clear idea of what that could mean. What if metropolitan was rebranded as something else? What if on a different, you know, cycle every 2 years or something along those lines, it was based on certain thematics, which would open up those possibilities of intersectionality, which would offer up different ideas for those who have been able, departments who have been able to create strong curriculum within that category and stay there and not let that work go wasted, but perhaps to expand it even further. But I still can't get over the idea that it's the metropolitan notion that seems to hinder us a little bit and possibly expanding that to an extent. Okay. Is that 10 minutes for the entire session? We're just getting going. Yeah, Rodney, go ahead.
Two thoughts that I've had. I have to admit, the metropolitan of all the perspectives categories, the one that I probably least understood. And a recent conversation I had with Allison McCartney finally gave me a perspective that I had never considered before. Because what I felt is, in a way, metropolitan was aligned with how Towson had been positioned under the presidency of Bob Corrett as a metropolitan institution, which I think was very misunderstood in terms of what that was intended to convey. But what Allison did for me was to connect some dots, not only in terms of the metropolitan, but connected it to the U.S. as a nation and also the global category as well. In that, what she shared with me was that, at the metropolitan, we are in a situation where U.S. and many other societies are increasingly becoming urbanized. And so at that micro level, there's a whole lot of issues that come with that. But it's not in isolation, but that's embedded within a context of the national culture in which you are, as well as us being part of a global environment as well. And so one of the things that we could consider is, rather than having these as three distinct categories, is again, approach this more in a thematic approach that can perhaps then make the relevance of looking at this as well. But I was also struck by one of the things that Dr. Chris had mentioned, how in their American Cultures course, that as part of one of the assignments was that students were expected to take the perspective of 3 different subcultures and to explore issues related to that. And that could certainly be an approach where we might approach, because this is one of those issues to me, and I'm not dismissing race and racism as being unimportant, but there's many other types of biases that are resonant in our society. And perhaps taking that type of an approach where the students may, one of them may be based on race, others may be on, say, sexual identity or whatever it whatever they might find personally relevant, might be a far more effective way for us to approach this. Okay, Shauna?
Hi, I'm Shauna Gass from the library. And this is bringing up a lot of different ideas. Some that have to do with the nature of the core in general, that there's a lot of interest in interdisciplinarity, students being able to relate different disciplines. I think we have to think of this theme and many other themes with an eye to the pedagogy, as well as we come to this as educators. These ideas really make sense to us because of the level where we are, the interdisciplinarity. I won't say it's a no-brainer, it's always a challenge, but we have to kind of step back and think about it from the student perspective. So, and be very intentional, not just about the category, but to really foster the kind of pedagogy that this is going to take. So if we're interested in intersectionality, we have to think, well, where are the students? Don't they need to sort of look at one thing at a time first, and instead of just putting them right into intersectionality? That's a lot to handle and understand if they can't understand even one of those perspectives. So potentially, intersectionality might be, by its nature, a more upper level kind of approach to take. Another thing about the metropolitan perspectives category that does sort of tend to suggest that it's a more upper level category if it were to be retained. That might make it stock, but is that you're looking at a system, so it's by its nature, it is more interdisciplinary too. So it's like, here the boundaries are in this metropolitan area, now let's look at all the different systems. So that sort of suggests that at a higher level for us.
I want to piggyback off of something Shauna said, and this is just a general idea. I hear a lot of people saying we should try to be incorporating this into all of our classes. A lot of great ideas being thrown around, which made me think about my classes. And for example, I teach a upper level, or excuse me, actually a graduate course on leadership, and there's a section on gender and culture. And I don't know that I'm any good at teaching it. It's not my main area of expertise, and so maybe to kind of piggyback off of what Shauna said, maybe we as educators need a little bit more help if we are interested in teaching this stuff, at doing a good job at it, and kind of what should they be learning, what should we be emphasizing, and so maybe a little bit more assistance for us who want to do it to be better at it.
Okay. Kimberly
program, Academic Achievement Center. I think I'm also just looking at basic life skills. When you have students come in to your classrooms or like into my center, they're just looking for, how am I going to make it out in the world? And so when we talk about the world as being so diverse, it's a lot of different things we've talked about here already. So maybe with even in the classes, maybe not getting so, maybe I'm not thinking of the right word, but so educationally focused in terms of the brain, but just thinking these young people need to know life skills. And life skills is about working, learning about, and dealing with people from all different backgrounds. So that's just
It's full of all these ideas in my head, which goes to my point. I love words. I love to talk about words and to analyze words, but my field of dance is the nonverbal. And when you are afraid of someone or want to understand the other, whichever the other is, you connect one-on-one with human. And so you sweat it together, when someone's looked at you, or caught you through the air, or picked you up from the ground, you are changed, and it cuts across all of the other categories in which you were predisposed to. And I just want to celebrate the nonverbal part of how we do this.
Small practical thought that doesn't need approval. The fact that you couldn't pick up courses from the content from their title. Coffee doesn't pick up that every other semester topics in diversity in the theater department is African American literature. Maybe we need to just make a list distributed to advisors and even better students of what is out there already as we are discussing these larger issues. And I would not describe it micro because that happens in every class every day, and we need to be able to model
Yes.
how to handle it.
No, and that was not meant to dismiss that. I just like to always have that conversation at the same time. I think that no matter what we do, this requires the recruitment and retention of more diverse faculty, and at the very least, at least 50 tenure track faculty lines added to this university. Don't you think?
Yes.
At least. I mean, at least.
Piece of cake.
Piece of cake, right? Yeah, please, real quick, Susan.
Adding on to what Susan Kirschberry, fellow Susan, suggested, I think one of the things that we need to think about is different modes of learning. So when we're talking about these important issues, not isolating the issues in a certain type of course. Of course, it's a social science course, or of course, it's a humanities course, or a history-based course, but embedding these really important issues in different modes of learning so that, for instance, our art students, our literature students can also gain access to discussion of issues of race, not placing it in one particular category. We could be an argument against the notion of a race course in the curriculum.
Well, it sounds like that at least, if anything, there are a number of tasks that were already in place, but maybe even more that have come out of the conversation, like you say, about creating a list of courses for advisors and everything else. I hesitate to say, let's form a committee or a task force, but perhaps, with further conversations with Rodney, we're continuing these, but I would think if anything, if a call was made by the provost's office for faculty to get involved in a conversation about this further, that perhaps some of the faculty and staff in this room would welcome participation in that, and perhaps we can at least keep some momentum going. So as I said, the gist of this was to try to reflect the moment that our students provided us at the end of the fall semester, and I wanted to try to I think all of us wanted to try to give some voice to that. Maggie?
Anybody who would be interested in continuing the conversation,
Right, because I spell my last name, just send it to provost@house.edu.
Karen, do you want to say something?
This is one aspect
parent committee or deans and chairs and faculty. But what I'm hearing here was, from my plan was, maybe to have a subgroup or maybe a group connected that could take a look at just coming up with some ways to address this specific part that could then be connected back to the structure.
And I think as a means to aid the list of requests that were generated by the students, is there a way that we can help the provost with that list of requests and try to meet the students with what they were asking of us? I think that was one of the reasons we wanted to try to start this conversation too. Thank you for everyone for participating. I wish we'd had a little bit more time. I think we could continue this dialogue, but maybe we could do it over lunch or in other venues as well. Thanks.